The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of First National Bank, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. A well-dressed man in his mid-30s stood patiently in line, his dark suit crisp and immaculate, holding a leather portfolio filled with important-looking documents. He'd arrived early, wanting to handle some paperwork before stepping into his new role as CEO of the bank. Looking around, he took in the grand architecture of what would now be his flagship branch, the soaring ceilings, the elegant chandeliers, and the bustling morning crowd of customers going about their daily business. His thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought him here. Years of hard work, countless late nights, and an unwavering determination to excel in the banking industry. The branch manager, a middle-aged woman with graying blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, stood near her office door, supervising the morning rush. She'd been watching him since he walked in, her eyes narrowing each time he shifted his weight or checked his phone. Something about him made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the thickness of his portfolio, or the way he seemed to be studying the bank's layout a little too carefully. As the line inched forward, the new CEO mentally reviewed his plans for his first day. He had so many ideas for improving operations, enhancing customer service, and modernizing the bank's approach to community engagement. His appointment had been kept under wraps to prevent any market speculation, with only the board and a handful of senior executives aware of the leadership change. The morning customers filtered in and out, a retired couple discussing their grandchildren's college fund, a small business owner making her weekly deposit, a young man opening his first savings account. The atmosphere was routine, ordinary, yet charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that only he could feel. He noticed a young teller glance his way, then quickly looked down at a memo on her desk, then back at him again. Her eyes widened slightly, but before she could say anything, the branch manager had already started making her way over, her heels clicking purposefully against the floor. The portfolio in his hands contained not just regular banking documents, but the future direction of the institution, proposals for community investment programs, plans for technological upgrades, and strategies to make banking more accessible to underserved neighborhoods. Little did he know that these papers, intended to mark the beginning of his leadership, would first become the center of an uncomfortable confrontation. As he finally reached the front of the line, he could feel the branch manager's presence behind him, her reflection visible in the teller's window. The morning sun continued to brighten, but a shadow was about to be cast over what should have been a routine transaction on this important day. The stage was set for a moment that would not only change his first day as CEO, but would eventually transform the entire culture of First National Bank. The branch manager stepped forward just as the new CEO was about to hand his documents to the teller. "Sir, would you mind stepping over to my office for a moment?" Her voice was formal, but carried an edge of authority that made several nearby customers turn their heads. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly, his deep voice steady and professional. He'd faced situations like this before, though he'd hoped those days were behind him. "We just need to verify some things," she said, gesturing toward her office. "It's standard procedure when we see unusual transactions." She emphasized the word unusual while eyeing his portfolio. The new CEO took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. He'd spent 15 years in banking, earned his MBA from a top university, and worked his way up through every level of management. Now, on his first day as CEO, he was being treated like a potential fraudster. "Ma'am, I'd assure you these are standard banking documents," he explained, opening his portfolio to show her. "If you just take a moment to review them properly." The branch manager cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "Sir, I've been managing this branch for 12 years. I know what suspicious activity looks like." She reached for his documents, her hands trembling slightly with what might have been nervousness or anger. Other customers in line began to shuffle uncomfortably. A young woman in a business suit looked on with concern, while an elderly man shook his head sadly. The tellers behind the counter exchanged worried glances, and one reached for her phone under the desk. "I'd like to speak with your superior," he said quietly, knowing full well there wasn't one. At least not in the traditional sense. The branch manager let out a short laugh. "Sir, I am the superior here. And until we verify these documents and your identity, you're not conducting any transactions in my branch." She clutched his paperwork tightly, her knuckles white against the crisp pages. He stood there, feeling the weight of every eye in the bank upon him. The morning sun that had seemed so promising earlier now felt harsh and exposing. He'd faced doubters throughout his career, but this confrontation felt different. Perhaps because this was supposed to be his moment of arrival, not another test of his patience. The security guard, an older man with kind eyes, hovered uncertainly nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The branch manager had positioned herself between the new CEO and the teller windows, as if protecting her staff from some imagined threat. "If you could just look at the letterhead on those documents," he suggested calmly, pointing to the bank's official logo. "Or perhaps we could call the main office." "Oh, we'll be making some calls," she interrupted, already reaching for her desk phone. "These documents look real, I'll give you that. Very professional. But something isn't adding up here, and we're going to get to the bottom of it." The irony of her words hung heavy in the air. Everything was indeed about to add up, just not in the way she expected. As she started dialing, a figure appeared at the bank's entrance, moving quickly toward them. The morning was about to take an unexpected turn, and the branch manager's world was about to be turned upside down. The situation in the bank lobby was quickly spinning out of control. Two security guards now stood at attention near the branch manager's office, their presence adding to the growing tension in the air. Several customers had pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding before them. "I'm going to need you to stay right here while we contact the authorities," the branch manager announced, her voice carrying across the now silent lobby. She held the documents away from the new CEO as if they might be contaminated, shuffling through them with exaggerated suspicion. A young bank employee who had been sorting mail in the back office peered around the corner, her eyes growing wide as she recognized the man being detained. She quickly disappeared back into the office area, her footsteps echoing as she ran down the hallway. The new CEO maintained his dignified stance, though his patience was being tested. "Let's think about this rationally," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Those documents you're holding have the bank's official watermark. They're signed by the board of directors. If you just take a moment to—" "Oh, I'm sure they look very official," the branch manager cut in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's exactly what concerns me. The level of detail in these forgeries is quite impressive." She began laying the papers out on a nearby desk, treating them like evidence at a crime scene. More customers had stopped their transactions to watch the scene unfold. An elderly woman whispered to her husband, "This isn't right," while a businessman in line checked his watch nervously, clearly torn between staying to see what would happen and making it to his morning meeting. The new CEO glanced at his own watch. In 30 minutes, he was supposed to be leading his first executive meeting. Instead, he was being treated like a criminal in his own bank. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but he knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. "Ma'am," he tried again, "if you just make one phone call to the executive office." "We'll be making plenty of phone calls," she interrupted, reaching for her desk phone again. "Starting with bank security and then moving on to the police. We take fraud very seriously at First National." The security guards shifted uncomfortably, picking up on something the branch manager seemed to be missing. The calm confidence of the man she was accusing, his perfectly tailored suit, the way he carried himself. One of them had started to lower his arms, his stern expression softening into uncertainty. Just then, commotion erupted from the back offices. Quick footsteps approached, accompanied by urgent voices. The young employee who had disappeared earlier was returning, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, several figures in business attire were hurrying toward the lobby, led by a woman clutching what appeared to be an internal memo. The branch manager was so focused on her perceived victory that she didn't notice the approaching group. She was still sorting through the papers, muttering about security protocols and proper documentation. The new CEO, however, saw them coming and allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the dust particles in the air, making the moment feel suspended in time. In just a few seconds, everything would change. The branch manager's world was about to shift dramatically, and a valuable lesson about assumptions and prejudice was about to be learned in front of a lobby full of witnesses. The head of HR burst into the scene like a gust of wind, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. "What on earth is going on here?" she demanded, waving a memo in her hand. Behind her, several executive board members followed, their faces a mix of concern and embarrassment. The branch manager looked up, startled by the interruption. "I'm handling a security situation," she said firmly, still clutching the documents. "This man is attempting to start his first day as our new CEO," the HR head finished, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. The branch manager's face went from confident to confused in a heartbeat. The memo about his appointment went out this morning to all branch managers. The color drained from the branch manager's face as the reality of the situation crashed down around her. Her hands, still holding the documents she'd been so suspicious of, began to tremble. The security guards immediately stepped back, their postures shifting from alert to apologetic. I didn't check my emails this morning," the branch manager stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was busy with the morning rush, and—" The new CEO straightened his tie calmly, his dignified demeanor unchanged. "Perhaps now would be a good time to review those documents properly," he suggested, his voice carrying no hint of anger or revenge, though he had every right to be furious. The watching customers began to murmur, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The young teller who had recognized him earlier was now explaining the situation to her colleagues in hushed tones, and waves of realization rippled through the staff. "Sir, I am so deeply sorry," the HR head began, but the CEO raised his hand gently to stop her. "What's important now," he said, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is not what just happened, but what we're going to do about it." He turned to address the entire lobby. "This moment, as uncomfortable as it is, represents exactly why I chose to accept this position. Change doesn't happen without uncomfortable moments." The branch manager looked like she might faint, her face alternating between deathly pale and burning red. "Sir, my position. I understand if you want my resignation immediately," she managed to say. A tense silence fell over the lobby. Everyone waited to see how the new CEO would handle this moment. Would he demand her immediate dismissal? Would he make an example of her? The power to end her career rested squarely in his hands. Instead, he smiled. Not a smile of triumph or mockery, but one of understanding. "What I want," he said, picking up the scattered documents himself, "is for you to join me in my first executive meeting this morning. I think you'll have some valuable insights to share about the changes we need to make in our training programs." The HR head's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but a look of approval crossed her face. The other executives nodded, some even smiled, recognizing that they were witnessing not just damage control, but true leadership in action. The morning sun had risen fully now, its light filling the lobby completely. The same light that had cast shadows earlier now seemed to illuminate a path forward. In the span of 15 minutes, a potential PR disaster had been transformed into an opportunity for genuine institutional change. Word of what had happened spread through the bank like wildfire. By mid-morning, every employee from the basement archives to the top floor knew about the incident. Groups of workers huddled around their desks, speaking in hushed tones about how the branch manager had unknowingly confronted their new CEO. The branch manager sat at her desk, her door closed for the first time in 5 years. She'd always maintained an open-door policy, proud of being accessible to her staff. But now she needed a moment alone. Her computer screen showed dozens of unread emails, including the one announcing the new CEO's appointment, sent at 7:30 that morning, right when she'd been dealing with a broken ATM in the lobby. Outside her office, the bank slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though things felt different. Tellers who had witnessed the scene kept glancing toward the executive floor, where their new CEO was now settling into his office. The security guards had changed their usual patrol route, seemingly avoiding eye contact with everyone. A young employee brought the branch manager a cup of coffee, knocking gently before entering. "The executive meeting starts in 10 minutes," she reminded her softly. The branch manager nodded, her hands smoothing her blazer repeatedly, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. The walk to the executive conference room felt like the longest journey of her career. Each step echoed in her ears as she made her way down the hallway. Employees watched her pass, their expressions a mix of sympathy and curiosity. She'd worked with most of them for years, built a reputation as a tough but fair manager. Now she wondered if that reputation was destroyed. In the executive conference room, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. The new CEO stood at the head of the table, reviewing documents with the HR head. He looked up when she entered, and to her surprise, pulled out the chair next to him. "I believe this seat would give you the best view of the presentation," he said warmly, gesturing to the chair. A few other executives exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The branch manager sank into the seat, feeling both honored and horrified by the proximity to the man she nearly had arrested an hour ago. The CEO began the meeting not with a recap of the morning's events, as everyone expected, but with his vision for the bank's future. He talked about community outreach, technological upgrades, and improved customer service. Then, unexpectedly, he turned to the branch manager. "What happened this morning," he said, addressing the whole room but looking at her, "showed us something important. It showed us where we need to improve, not just in our procedures, but in our understanding of each other." The branch manager found her voice, though it quivered slightly. "Sir, I can't apologize enough for my actions," she began, but he shook his head. "Instead of an apology," he suggested, "I'd like your help. You've been on the front lines of this bank for years. You know our customers, our procedures, our strengths, and our weaknesses. What changes would you recommend to prevent something like this from happening again?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the branch manager. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just about saving her job. It was about making real change. She straightened in her chair, pulled out her notepad, and began to speak. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, warming the space with natural light. Sometimes, she would think later, our darkest professional moments can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, the new CEO sat in his office reviewing files on his computer. The events of the morning had sparked something in him, a determination to turn this incident into meaningful change. The soft glow of his desk lamp cast shadows across stacks of incident reports he'd requested from HR. As he scrolled through the complaints database, patterns began to emerge. The morning's events weren't as isolated as some might have thought. There were dozens of reports from customers who felt unfairly treated, their concerns often dismissed or buried in paperwork. Each report told a story of someone who walked into the bank feeling hopeful and left feeling diminished. He picked up his coffee cup, now cold from hours of neglect, and walked to the window. The city lights twinkled below, each one perhaps representing someone who might walk into one of their branches tomorrow. Would they be treated with respect? Would they be judged by their appearance rather than their character? His phone buzzed, a message from his wife asking when he'd be home. Just reviewing some important files, he typed back, "This can't wait until tomorrow." She would understand. She always did. She knew that when he set his mind to fixing something, he wouldn't rest until he had a plan. Returning to his desk, he opened a fresh document and began typing. The branch manager's earlier suggestions in the meeting had been surprisingly insightful. Despite her morning mistake, she clearly understood the bank's operations at a deep level. Her ideas about updating training programs and revising customer service protocols could form the foundation of something bigger. As he worked, he thought about his own journey in banking. 20 years ago, he'd stood in lines similar to this morning's, feeling those same suspicious glances, enduring those same assumptions. He promised himself that if he ever reached a position of real influence, he'd work to change things. The cleaning staff passed by his office, surprised to see him still there. He waved kindly, remembering how his father used to work late nights as a janitor at a bank much like this one. Everyone who works in this building deserves respect, he muttered to himself, adding another point to his growing document. Around midnight, he sat back and reviewed what he'd written. The plan was comprehensive. New training programs, revised security protocols, community engagement initiatives, and most importantly, a complete overhaul of how the bank handled customer interactions. But something was still missing. He opened the branch manager's personnel file again. Her record was nearly spotless, 15 years of service, numerous commendations, consistently positive customer feedback. Today's incident stood out like a dark stain on an otherwise exemplary career. Then it hit him. She wasn't the problem, she was part of the solution. Who better to help implement these changes than someone who had just experienced firsthand how badly they were needed? Someone who had the humility to admit their mistakes and the courage to suggest improvements even while facing possible termination. He added one final section to his document: program leadership. Under it, he wrote a note about appointing the branch manager to head the new training initiative. Her experience, both good and bad, would make her message more powerful than any consultant they could hire. As he finally shut down his computer and gathered his things, he felt satisfied. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but also opportunities. The incident that could have ended in tragedy was about to become the catalyst for real change. The next morning, the executive conference room filled up early. Senior managers shifted nervously in their seats, unsure of what to expect. The branch manager sat in her assigned seat next to the CEO's chair, her back straight, but her hands fidgeting with a pen under the table. Everyone had heard about yesterday's incident, and rumors about possible consequences flew around the room in whispered conversations. The CEO walked in carrying a thick folder, his presence immediately commanding attention. The room fell silent. Instead of sitting down, he remained standing, looking around at each face in the room. His expression was serious but not stern, determined but not angry. Yesterday, he began, his voice calm and clear. Our bank experienced something that could have been a disaster. Instead, we're going to turn it into an opportunity. He opened his folder and began passing out documents to everyone present. The branch manager's hands trembled slightly as she received her copy. What you're looking at, he continued, is data from the past 5 years. Customer complaints, service issues, and incident reports. But more importantly, you're looking at our chance to make real change. He clicked a button, and a presentation appeared on the large screen behind him. The first slide showed photographs of different customers, young and old, from various backgrounds, all going about their banking business. Every person who walks through our doors has a story, he said. They have dreams, goals, and reasons for trusting us with their money. But sometimes we forget that. The branch manager looked down at her copy of the documents, her eyes widening as she recognized some of the patterns in the data. These were issues she'd seen firsthand, but had never viewed from this perspective. Now, the CEO said, turning to face the branch manager directly, I'd like our branch manager to share her thoughts on what happened yesterday, and more importantly, her ideas for preventing similar situations in the future. The room grew tense. Everyone expected a public reprimand or even a resignation announcement. Instead, the branch manager stood up, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger as she spoke. Yesterday, I made a terrible mistake, she began. I let assumptions and biases cloud my judgment. But through this experience, I've realized something important. I'm probably not the only one who needs to change how they think and act. She walked to the front of the room, standing beside the CEO. From her pocket, she pulled out a folded piece of paper covered in notes she'd written the night before. I've been thinking about changes we need to make. Real, practical changes in how we train our staff, how we approach customer service, and how we create a truly welcoming environment. The CEO nodded encouragingly as she outlined her ideas. Other executives began taking notes, some nodding in agreement. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to engagement as she described specific situations she'd witnessed over the years and suggested solutions. And finally, she said, her voice now firm with conviction, I volunteer to be the first to go through any new training program we develop. My experience should serve as a learning opportunity for others. The CEO stepped forward again. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear, he said. Because I'm appointing you to lead our new customer service transformation initiative. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. The branch manager stood frozen, processing what she just heard. Sometimes, the CEO added, addressing the whole room, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest contributions, if we're willing to learn from them. Over the next few months, the bank underwent a remarkable transformation. The branch manager threw herself into her new role with unexpected passion. Her office, once a symbol of authority, became a hub of learning and change. Where there used to be awards and certificates, now there were posters about inclusion and customer service guidelines. On this particular morning, she stood before a group of new employees, sharing her story. I could have lost everything that day, she told them, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Instead, I learned the most valuable lesson of my career. The training room was packed, not just with new hires, but with veteran employees who had requested to attend. She had developed a unique approach to training. Instead of dry presentations and rulebooks, she used real stories, including her own, to demonstrate the impact of unconscious bias. Employees were encouraged to share their own experiences, both good and bad, creating an atmosphere of honest dialogue. The CEO often dropped by these sessions unannounced, sitting quietly in the back. He watched as the woman who had once profiled him became one of the bank's most powerful advocates for change. Sometimes he would share his own stories, helping employees understand that everyone, from entry-level tellers to top executives, had a role to play in creating a more inclusive environment. The changes weren't just happening in training rooms. The entire bank's approach to customer service was being revolutionized. Security protocols were updated to focus on specific behaviors rather than appearances. Tellers were trained to greet everyone with the same level of respect and courtesy. Even the physical layout of branches was being modified to feel more welcoming. One day, an elderly customer approached the branch manager after finishing his transaction. You know, he said, I've been banking here for 40 years, but something's different now. It feels warmer somehow. She smiled, knowing that these small moments of recognition meant their efforts were working. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some longtime employees resisted the changes, claiming they were unnecessary. Others worried that new security procedures would make their jobs more difficult. But as positive feedback began pouring in from customers, even the skeptics started to come around. The branch manager kept a special folder in her desk. In it, she collected letters from customers and employees sharing their experiences with the bank's new approach. One note particularly touched her. A young entrepreneur wrote about how, for the first time, he felt truly valued when discussing his business plans. The CEO's support never wavered. He made sure the initiative had the resources it needed, often citing the program's success in board meetings. We're not just changing policies, he would say. We're changing lives. The bank's customer satisfaction scores began to rise, and other branches started requesting training sessions. As she wrapped up another training session, the branch manager noticed a new employee raising her hand. "Weren't you worried," the young woman asked, "about sharing your mistake with everyone?" The room grew quiet, waiting for the answer. The branch manager smiled thoughtfully. "At first, yes," she admitted. "But I realized something important. We can't expect others to learn from our experiences if we're not willing to share them honestly. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to the most meaningful changes, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us." 1 year after the incident, the bank's main lobby was filled with people, but not for regular banking business. Local news cameras lined the walls, and community leaders filled the seats. The CEO stood at a small podium, the branch manager seated proudly in the front row. "1 year ago," he began, "something happened in this very lobby that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together and made us stronger." He gestured to a large screen behind him showing the bank's latest community impact report. The numbers told an impressive story. Customer satisfaction up by 40%, employee retention improved by 35%, and community engagement at an all-time high. The branch manager watched from her seat, thinking about how much had changed. Her training program had been adopted by all 50 branches of the bank, and other banks were starting to take notice. Just last week, she'd been invited to speak at a national banking conference about transforming corporate culture. "But numbers only tell part of the story," the CEO continued. "The real success is in the lives we've touched." He invited several people to share their experiences. A small business owner talked about how the bank's new approach had helped her secure her first loan. A retired teacher described how welcomed he felt every time he visited. A young teller shared how the training had changed her entire perspective on customer service. The branch manager's eyes misted over as she listened. Each story reminded her of that fateful morning when she'd nearly ruined her career through her own prejudice. Now that mistake had become a powerful teaching tool, helping others recognize and overcome their own biases. The CEO called her to the podium. As she stood to address the crowd, she saw many familiar faces, employees she'd trained, customers whose trust she'd earned back, and colleagues who'd supported the changes she'd championed. But what touched her most were the new faces, people who would never know that morning a year ago, because the bank had become a different place. "When I walk through our lobby now," she said, her voice clear and confident, "I see something beautiful. I see people being treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. I see employees who understand that every interaction is an opportunity to make someone feel valued." The CEO returned to the podium to make one final announcement. The bank's training program was being expanded into a full community initiative, partnering with local schools and businesses to promote inclusion and understanding. The branch manager would lead this expanded program while continuing to train new employees. As the crowd applauded, a young employee who'd recently completed the training program approached the branch manager. "You know," she said quietly, "when you shared your story in training, it helped me recognize some of my own biases. Yesterday, I caught myself making assumptions about a customer, but I stopped and remembered what you taught us." The CEO watched this interaction from across the room, smiling. This was exactly what he hoped for when he'd chosen not to fire the branch manager that day. Not just change within the bank, but a ripple effect that would spread through the entire community. As the event wound down, sunlight streamed through the lobby windows, just as it had on that morning a year ago. But now it illuminated a very different bank, one where mistakes were seen as opportunities for growth, where every person who walked through the doors was treated with dignity, and where one moment of poor judgment had transformed into a movement for positive change.